and Syrian government troops.
Martin, since the uprising in Syria started in 2011, the Kurdish factions were quick to control half of the city of Hasaka, and the army maintained a presence, particularly government buildings, garrisons and military bases. And there was some sort of tacit agreement between the Syrian government and the Kurdish factions to avoid confrontation, prompting the other Syrian rebel factions to accuse the Kurdish fighters of colluding with the Syrian regime. Now things are changing on the ground, and the Kurdish factions, particularly the YPG, which is the armed military branch of the Kurdish factions, is now on the offensive, saying that it is determined this time to drive Assad fighters, soldiers out of Hasaka and control it. As we speak, Martin, Kurdish fighters control a huge area in northern Syria that stretches from Hasaka all the way to Afrin on the outskirts of Aleppo. This is quite significant for them because this is part of their self-autonomous region, which they call Rojava, and they seem to be pretty much determined this time to continue the fight until all that area is uncontested and under their own control.
And this is likely then, Hashim, isn't it, to set alarm bells ringing in the region, because it's not just the Syrian government who are reluctant to allow more power, more self-determination for the Kurds in northeastern Syria.
Absolutely. This is a development that is closely monitored by the Turkish government, which has in the past voiced concerns about the territorial gains made by the SDF, which is the umbrella organization of the different Kurdish factions fighting in northern Syria. The Turkish government accuses most of these factions, particularly the YPG, of being an extension of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, which Turkey considers a terrorist organization. And the Turkish government said in the past that it is definitely not going to tolerate a Syrian Kurdish presence on the border with Turkey. It's quite also delicate for the Americans because over the past 2 years in particular, the Americans have been teaming up with the SDF in their push to drive ISIL out of the areas they control in northern Syria. And with the fighting now raging between government troops and the Kurdish factions, this is going to put the Americans in a very delicate situation. They made it quite clear in the past that the Kurdish factions are their major allies in Syria, and just a few days ago, when the Syrian government was pounding Kurdish areas in Hasaka, the Americans had to scramble some of the Syrian aircrafts for fear that their own special operations ground forces might be targeted in those airstrikes. So the general sentiment as we speak in Syria is that people are concerned Syria may never be the same again, or might just further fall apart, because each faction is determined this time to have its own land.
Hashim Al-Khubara, live in Gaziantep. Thank you.
The main Kurdish armed faction, the YPG, takes over a government building in Hasaka, tearing apart portraits of President Bashar al-Assad. YPG fighters also opened fire on government positions. Hasaka is a divided city. The Kurds are taking over more areas, while government troops are confined to military bases and garrisons. Syrian army artillery has also been pounding Kurdish positions aimed at halting the YPG advance. Families are fleeing to safety from the fighting nearby. Schools in the city of Qamishli have become makeshift refugee camps to cope with the growing number of displaced people.
I fled Hasaka when Syrian jets were striking civilian areas. I gave birth to my baby boy on the way to here. It was very painful. I don't know what will happen to us next.
The Kurds have gained more territory since the start of the war. Now they are in control of a large area stretching from Hasaka in northeastern Syria all the way to Afrin north of Aleppo. Al-Bab and Jarablus remain under ISIL control. It's all part of what is in effect an autonomous Kurdish region known as Rojava. The Turkish army shelled Kurdish positions in Syria in the past, accusing the YPG of being an extension of the PKK, which the Turkish government considers a terrorist organization. The latest push by the Kurds to take over Hasaka is likely to further increase Turkey's concerns. Hashim al-Barra, Al Jazeera, Gaziantep.
It's being seen as the most violent confrontation in the city of Hasaka since the Syrian war began more than 5 years ago. On one side, fighters from the Kurdish rebel group, the YPG. In Hasaka, they're known as the Asaish. On the other side, forces loyal to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Government troops are clinging to control of this, the last bastion of government control in the city. The governor's office and several government buildings are in the heart of Hasaka. Kurdish fighters have made territorial gains and inched ever closer. They've issued leaflets and broadcast messages on loudspeakers. They want Syrian government forces out and say pro-government militia must surrender. Throughout Syria's war, the opposing sides have had an uneasy relationship, even fighting on the same side last year to dislodge ISIL. This confrontation is an unprecedented escalation. Kurdish fighters accuse Syrian government forces in Hasaka of working with Turkey to undermine Kurdish aspirations for autonomy in the region. The Syrian government says Kurdish forces have broken a truce agreement and created chaos. The Kurds deny a formal truce deal ever existed. The Syrian government responded last week with airstrikes, reportedly the first on Kurdish targets in Syria's war. The bombs fell close to US special forces assisting the Kurds in their fight against ISIL. US fighter jets were called in. While the Syrian warplanes left, it's reportedly one of the closest encounters between US and Syrian forces in the conflict. Hasaka is home to an ethnic mix of civilians, Kurds in the eastern neighbourhoods, Arabs in the south, and a large Christian community. Its population is also swelled with Syrians escaping ISIL and fighting in other parts of Syria. Large numbers are now seeking refuge outside Hasaka, leaving behind the ruins of a once thriving, ethnically vibrant city, now a key battleground in Syria's long-running war. Miriam Nahond, Al Jazeera.
In northeastern Syria, thousands have fled from a third day of government airstrikes and fighting between Kurdish forces and pro-government militia. On Friday, the Pentagon acknowledged sending jets to protect U.S. Special Operations Forces and advisors, training Kurdish fighters in the city of Hasaka. It's warning the Syrian government to avoid targeting U.S. and coalition personnel. A Syrian military official says the air raids are in response to Kurdish forces attacking government buildings and committing what he calls crimes against civilians.
Despite all the attempts to end the situation and re-establish calm and stability in the city, the Kurdish security force didn't respond and continued to commit their crimes, aiming to take control of Hasaka city, which led to a proportionate response from the Syrian Arab army.
Throughout the Syrian conflict, government forces and Kurdish fighters have mostly stayed away from one another. The Kurds have focused on holding territory in the north and helping U.S.-backed forces fight ISIL. Government forces have taken aim at opposition groups fighting to topple President Assad. If the bombing of Kurdish-held territory signals a strategy shift by the Syrian government, it'll be one that could be welcomed by Syria's neighbor to the north, Turkey. Turkey has long viewed Kurdish separatists in the region as its #1 threat. The Turkish government is an important NATO ally in the conflict and a supporter to some of Syria's leading opposition groups. But in recent weeks, the Turkish government has renewed ties with Syria's allies, Russia and Iran. And on Saturday, Turkish Prime Minister Binali Yildirim told reporters that Iran, Gulf countries, the U.S. and Russia can work together to find a solution in Syria. Analysts believe we're seeing that cooperation at work.
For now, there are two regional powers, which is Turkey and Iran. They are very concerned about the establishment of an independent Kurdish entity in the north of Syria. And the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad, of course, shared them this concern. So I think I think the three powers now, they have common interest in confronting the Kurds.
Just as we've seen many times during this long-running civil war, alliances have apparently shifted. The immediate consequence is more violence and suffering for civilians. Reza Sayah, Al Jazeera, Gaziantep, along the Turkish-Syrian border. The aftermath of shelling in Idlib province. The building hit appears to be someone's home. Rescue crews look for survivors, but all they find are remains of the victims. Images too graphic to show. The casualties here were among scores of civilians killed in another 24 hours of intense fighting throughout Syria. Opposition activists say on Thursday night government forces bombed the Damascus suburb of Daraya with napalm, a flammable mixture of gel and fuel that's banned for use against civilian targets. The bombs hit Daraya's last remaining hospital. Throughout this conflict, rights groups have accused both sides of using chemical weapons. Neither the government nor rebel groups have ever been held accountable. Elsewhere in Syria, ISIL released video that appears to show a suicide car bombing targeting Kurdish fighters. ISIL claims 30 fighters were killed in the attack that happened just south of Manbij. It was last week when Kurdish militias, fighting as part of the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, managed to push ISIL forces out of Manbij, a town ISIL had controlled for more than 2 years. The suicide bombing targeting Kurdish fighters could be payback and a sign that ISIL can still carry out attacks against its enemies. If there's any positive news over the past 24 hours, it is some new hope for a temporary cessation of hostilities. On Thursday, the Russian Defense Ministry said it was willing to support a UN proposal for a 48-hour pause in fighting starting next week. But the Russian government has attached conditions, suggesting there's still negotiating to be done before a plan is put in place. Even if a plan is put in place, many experts say it's highly unlikely that armed groups like ISIL and Fatah al-Sham, formerly Al-Nusra fronts, will respect it.